I want to tell you something I have never said out loud before. The day I handed in that document, I was shaking, not from fear, from 3 years of anger that had finally found somewhere to go. My hands were steady when I walked into that building, but inside I was on fire, quiet fire, the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that just burns. I had 41 pages in a bound folder under my arm. 18 months of everything he had done, every humiliation, every stolen credit, every time he had smiled at me like I was nothing while presenting my work to people who would never know my name. I placed it on Gloria Chen's desk. I looked her in the eye, and I said, "I need you to read all of it." She read it over the weekend. By Monday morning, a company-wide investigation had been opened. By Friday, Douglas Hale was escorted from the building after 17 years. And I want to be honest with you about something. When I found out, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, the kind of tired that only comes when you have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and you finally put it down. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't felt in 18 months. I felt like I mattered. Like what had happened to me had mattered, like the record I had built in silence, alone, at my kitchen table, at 11 p.m. on nights when I couldn't sleep, had actually meant something. That feeling, I want you to understand it, because it is the reason I am telling this story. I joined Carver Strategic Group in 2020, Atlanta, Georgia, corporate advisory firm. I was 31 years old, and I thought I had finally found the place where my career would take off. I was right about the company, wrong about the manager. His name, for the purposes of this, is Douglas Hale. 52 years old. 17 years at Carver. The kind of man who has been somewhere so long that the institution has shaped itself around him. The kind of man who mistakes longevity for legacy. I want to tell you what Douglas Hale looked like in a meeting with senior leadership. Calm, thoughtful, the measured voice of experience. The kind of manager you look at and think, I want to work for someone like that. That was the version he showed upstairs. The version he showed us was different, and it took me exactly 4 months to understand that the difference was not an accident. The first time he humiliated me, I told myself I had misread the room, that he was having a bad day, that I was being too sensitive. The second time I told myself the same thing. The third time I started to wonder. The fourth time I opened a document on my laptop and typed the date and what had happened and who had been in the room. I didn't know what I was building yet. I just knew I needed to write it down. Because something in me understood, even before my conscious mind did, that what was happening was not random. It was a pattern, and patterns, if you catch them early enough, can be proven. Let me tell you what the humiliation actually looked like. Because I think people imagine it as something dramatic, something obviously wrong. It wasn't. It was precise, surgical, designed to be deniable. It was the way he would wait until I was mid-sentence in a team meeting and then begin a side conversation with someone else, not loudly. Just enough to fracture the room's attention, just enough to make me feel the ground shift under my words. It was the way he would correct me, in front of everyone, on things that didn't need correcting, not errors. Preferences, his preferences delivered in the tone of fact. It was the way he once said in a meeting with 7 people present that my analysis showed promise but needed adult supervision before it was client-ready. I was 31 years old. I had been doing this work for 6 years. And I sat there and nodded and said, "Thank you," and went home and wrote it down. That one I wrote down in capital letters, because something about the phrase adult supervision, the specific condescension of it, told me that this was not a manager having a bad day. This was a man who had decided what I was and was performing that decision for an audience. The credit theft was harder to document, harder to name, because in the moment it never felt like theft. It felt like translation. He would take something I had built and present it upstairs in language that made it sound like it had emerged from a collaborative process he had been guiding. And I would sit in the audience watching my own work become his narrative and not quite be able to point to the exact moment it had stopped being mine. But I had timestamps. I had version histories. I had the emails where I had sent him the finished document, and he had replied with 2 words, "Looks good," before walking it into a boardroom and describing it as something I'd been developing with the team. I had the Slack messages where colleagues had congratulated me on a piece of work. that Douglas had already presented without my name. I had the draft where I had written every word, and the final version where the document header read, "Prepared by Douglas Hale, Senior Director." I had all of it. And every time I added something to the record, something in me got calmer. Not because I was planning revenge, because I was taking control of the only thing I could actually control, the truth, my version of it, documented, specific, irrefutable. The favoritism was the thing that hurt the most. I want to be honest about that. Because the humiliation made me angry, and the credit theft made me feel erased, but the favoritism made me feel crazy. Like I was imagining it. Like I was the problem. There were two people on the team who operated in a completely different reality than the rest of us. Marcus and Diane. They had both been with Douglas for more than 4 years. They had learned, I don't know if consciously or not, how to be exactly what he needed, how to agree in the right moments, how to make him feel respected in the particular way he required, and in return they got everything. The good clients, the strategic accounts, the projects that appeared in promotion cases, the invitations to leadership off-sites that the rest of us heard about second-hand, the opportunities that compounded year after year into career trajectories that bore no relationship to talent or output. And the rest of us got the support work, the operational infrastructure, the important invisible labor of keeping things running that never, ever appears in a performance review as evidence of readiness for the next level. I watched 3 colleagues leave in my first year, smart people. People who had been doing excellent work that nobody senior ever properly saw. Each of them gave a diplomatic answer in their official exit. Each of them told me something different when we said goodbye in the parking lot. I remember the last one clearly. A woman named Serena, brilliant analyst. She had been at Carver for 2 years. She gave her notice on a Thursday. On her last day she stopped by my desk and said, very quietly, without drama, "I hope you find a way to say what the rest of us couldn't." I thought about that for a long time. Find a way to say what the rest of us couldn't. She wasn't asking me to do anything. She was just naming something, a responsibility that comes with being the person who stayed. I stayed for 8 more months after Serena left. 8 months in which I did my work, continued building the record, and began to understand something important about what I was actually doing. I wasn't building a complaint, I was building a case. And there is a fundamental difference between the two. A complaint is emotional. A case is structural. A complaint says, "This hurt me." A case says, "This happened on these dates to these people with these witnesses, and here is the documented evidence of each instance." I had decided, somewhere around month 12, that when I left Carver, I would leave in a way that made it impossible for Douglas Hale to do to the next person what he had done to me, and to Serena, and to the 3 before her, and to everyone in that team who had quietly recalibrated their ambitions downward to avoid his attention. I began researching what an exit interview could actually contain, what it could demand, what a company was legally and professionally obligated to do with a formal written submission that included specific documented allegations. The answer was more than most people realize. A well-documented formal complaint submitted during the exit process is not a form. It is not a conversation. It is a record. It exists. It must be filed. And if its contents are specific enough, credible enough, it is very difficult for a professionally functioning HR department to receive it and do nothing. The key word is specific, not, he often made people feel small. Specific. On March 14, 2021. In the client debrief meeting with Vertex Corp, Douglas Hale told Priya Sharma in front of the client that her analysis was undergraduate-level thinking and did not address her again for the remainder of the 2-hour session. That is a complaint that cannot be dismissed as a feeling. That is a complaint that has a date, a location, a victim, a witness, the client, and a verbatim quote. I had 31 of those, across 18 months, organized into 3 categories, cross-referenced by pattern, with 14 exhibits attached. In October 2021, I received an offer I had been quietly working toward for 3 months. a senior advisory role at a firm with a culture I had researched carefully, through people I trusted, not just through Glassdoor ratings. Better compensation. A manager whose reputation for transparency had been confirmed by 3 separate sources who had worked directly under her. I gave my notice on a Monday morning. 4 weeks, more than required. I wanted to leave nothing undone. I wanted Douglas to have no legitimate criticism of my departure. I wanted to hand over every project in perfect condition and walk out of that building in a way that gave him nothing to say about me except that I had left professionally. That mattered to me, not for his sake, for mine. Because I had learned that the most powerful exit is not the dramatic one. It is the one that is so clean, so thorough, so professionally unimpeachable that the only story left standing is the one you wrote down. During my 4 weeks' notice, I completed the record. I had been adding to it for 18 months. Now I organized it, structured it. Read it from the beginning, as if I were a stranger encountering it for the first time. It was coherent. It was credible. It was devastating in the quiet, specific way that only documented truth can be. I requested a written exit interview. I emailed Gloria Chen, the HR director, and told her I had substantial feedback I wished to submit in written form and that the volume and specificity of my submission would require more than a standard 30-minute conversation. She agreed the same day. She asked how long the document would be. I told her approximately 40 pages. There was a pause. Then she said she would give it her full attention. I spent my final week finalizing the formatting, consistent font, numbered paragraphs, a table of contents, a cover page that read simply, cleanly. Exit interview. Submission. Carver Strategic Group. Confidential. I printed it. I had it bound at a copy shop near my apartment. The person behind the counter asked what it was for. I said, professional feedback. She smiled and handed me the bound copy, and I stood in that shop holding 41 pages of everything and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something close to peace. I submitted it on my second-to-last day. Printed copy on Gloria Chen's desk. PDF emailed with read receipt enabled. I watched the read receipt confirm delivery at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I went home. I made dinner. I watched something I don't remember. I went to bed. And for the first time in a very long time, I slept properly. The next day was my last. I completed my handover. I said goodbye to the people I genuinely cared about, and there were several because not everything about those 18 months was Douglas Hale. Some of it was the colleagues who would become real friends in the way that people become real friends when they are surviving something together. I didn't see Douglas on my way out. His office light was on. I did not stop. I did not knock. I did not need to. I started my new role the following Monday. New desk, new city. I had relocated, new manager. On my first morning I sat down and looked around the office and thought, this is what normal feels like. I had forgotten. On Wednesday of that first week an email arrived from Gloria Chen. Brief, professional. She thanked me for my submission. She told me it had been reviewed over the weekend by herself and the chief people officer. She told me a formal investigation had been opened. She told me I might be contacted for follow-up. I read that email 3 times. A formal investigation had been opened, not a conversation. Not a note in a file. An investigation, I replied with one word. Understood. And I went back to work. 8 days later, the follow-up request came. A video call, Gloria Chen and an external HR investigator. They had brought in outside counsel, which told me immediately that the company understood the seriousness of what they were dealing with. The call lasted 90 minutes. I answered every question by referring to the specific section of the record. I didn't speak from memory. I spoke from the document. Because the document was more precise than my memory, and because I had learned, during 18 months of building it, that precision is the only currency that matters in these situations. At the end of the call, the external investigator said something I have thought about many times since. She said that in 17 years of conducting workplace investigations, my submission was among the most organized and credible she had encountered. 17 years, most organized. I thought about the nights I had spent writing without emotion when there was so much emotion available, the discipline of treating something personal as something professional, the choice made over and over every time I opened that document to write the incident rather than the feeling. That discipline was the whole thing. That discipline was what made it work. The investigation ran for 3 weeks. I know now, from a former colleague who was interviewed as part of the process, that 11 people were questioned in total. 7 of them gave accounts that were consistent with what I had documented. 7, in a team that had never formally spoken about what was happening, in a culture where speaking felt dangerous. 7 people who had been individually carrying the same experience without knowing that 6 others were carrying it too. My document had given their experiences a structure to attach to, a spine, a framework that made individual incidents into a collective pattern. And a collective pattern is something a company cannot look at and dismiss as one person's perception. I think about those 7 people a lot. I never met most of them. Some had left Carver before my time, but they were part of what happened. Their accounts, their willingness to speak when asked, were part of what made the investigation reach the conclusion it reached. We were all part of the same story. I was just the one who had written it down. The investigation concluded on a Thursday. Gloria Chen emailed me that afternoon. The review was complete. Appropriate action had been taken. She thanked me for my contribution. Appropriate action. The careful language of corporate accountability. A former colleague texted me that Friday. 5 words. He's gone. Effective immediately. I was at my new desk when I read that. I put my phone face down. I looked out the window for a long time, and then I went back to the work in front of me, because that was always the point, not the ending. But what comes after? Douglas Hale, 17 years, gone by Friday. I want to talk about something that people don't usually include in these stories. The guilt, because I felt it, not a lot, but some. Not guilt about what I had done. I know what I did was right. I felt guilty about the people who had left before me who had never had this option. Serena. The 3 before her. The ones I never knew. They had all carried the same weight and walked out with nothing resolved. I couldn't do anything about that, but I could make sure that the person who came after me didn't have to start from zero, that the culture they walked into was different, that the 17-year pattern had been interrupted, officially, formally, permanently. 3 months after Douglas left, I heard through the network that Carver had brought in a new team lead, someone with a completely different style, transparent, direct. Attribution conscious, meaning work was credited to the people who produced it, publicly, consistently. 2 of my former colleagues reached out independently within that first quarter. Both of them said versions of the same thing, that the team felt different, that people were speaking in meetings without bracing for the response, that the specific dread of Monday mornings, the dread that Douglas Hale had manufactured so deliberately over 17 years, was gone, because 41 pages had landed on the right desk at the right time. I want to tell you something about the decision to write it. Because people ask me, wasn't it risky? Weren't you afraid it would follow you? Weren't you afraid nothing would happen and you would have done all of that for nothing? Yes, I was afraid of all of those things, every single one. But I had spent 18 months watching what fear does when you let it make your decisions. Fear keeps you at your desk. Fear keeps you nodding. Fear keeps you writing. Looks good in the reply field when what you want to write is, "This is mine, and you know it." Fear is the whole mechanism. It is what makes a Douglas Hale possible, not his intelligence, not his seniority, not his 17 years. Fear, the fear of being labeled difficult, the fear of the reference, the fear that saying something will cost you more than saying nothing. The moment I decided the fear was not a reason to stay quiet, but a sign of exactly how necessary it was to speak, the document became possible. The 41 pages became possible. All of it became possible. Because here is the truth about fear in these situations. The fear of speaking is almost always worse than speaking. The thing you imagine, the professional consequences, the retaliation, the dismissal, almost never materializes in the way you imagine it. What actually happens when you speak with specificity and documentation and calm is that you are taken seriously because you have done the work of making yourself impossible to dismiss. I want to give you something practical before we get to the end of this, because this story is not just mine. Versions of it are happening right now in offices everywhere, and the people living those versions deserve something concrete to take away. Start the document today, not when you decide to leave. Today. Call it whatever you want. The record, notes, dates, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you open it and you begin. Because the discipline of documentation changes your relationship to what is happening to you. It moves you from someone things are being done to someone who is building a record of what is being done. That shift is not small. It changes everything about how you carry the experience. Write without emotion. I know that is hard. I know that when you have just been humiliated in front of 7 people, your hands are shaking, and the last thing you feel like doing is writing calmly. But the document is not the place for the feeling. The feeling belongs somewhere else, with a friend, with a therapist, with whoever holds those things for you. The document is for the facts, date, setting, people present, words used, impact observable, include witnesses. Every person who was in the room, not because you will necessarily contact them, but because their presence is part of the record. And sometimes when an investigation is opened, those witnesses are contacted independently. And when they confirm what you documented, the case becomes something different entirely. Attach everything that exists, emails, Slack messages, time-stamped documents, version histories, anything that supports what you have written. Not everything will be available. But what is available, attach it. Every exhibit makes the document harder to dismiss. Research the exit interview process at your company. Understand what a formal written submission triggers legally and professionally. In many organizations, a formal written complaint submitted during the exit process must be investigated, not considered. Investigated. Know this before you submit, because knowing it changes how you write and what you include. And when the time comes to submit, submit to the right person, not your manager's peer, not the generalist who processes the standard form, the HR director, the chief people officer, the person whose professional responsibility includes making sure that what you are describing does not continue. Address it to them by name, in writing, with read receipts. I know some of you are reading this and thinking, my company won't do anything. My HR is part of the problem. My situation is different. Maybe. Sometimes that is true. But here is what I know. A well-documented, formally submitted written complaint creates a record that exists regardless of what the company does with it. It exists in their files. It exists in your copies. And if the company does nothing, that nothing is now also documented. And documented nothing has a way of becoming very relevant when the next person comes forward, or the one after that. You are not just writing for now, you are writing for the person who comes after you, who will walk into the same office, sit across from the same manager, and begin to experience the same slow erosion of their confidence and their credit and their professional joy. That person deserves to have your record. They deserve to know they are not imagining it. They deserve the spine your documentation provides for their own account. Douglas Hale operated for 17 years because everyone who left took their experience with them when they walked out the door. They carried it privately, and it died with the tenure. I refuse to let that happen one more time. I refuse to be one more quiet departure that left the pattern intact. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. When you leave, and you will leave, because people always eventually leave environments that don't deserve them, ask yourself one question before you walk out that door. Am I leaving quietly because it is safe, or because I am afraid? Because those are two different things. And only one of them is a reason. The other one, the fear, is exactly what kept Douglas Hale in that building for 17 years. Don't let it keep the next one there too.